Kia ora and good morning and welcome to BHN. Big Hairy News for another day, and we welcome as co-host today Mahdis Azarmandi. Dr. Mahdis Azarmandi. Mahdis, thanks for joining us, man.
Kia ora.
Kia ora and welcome. Dr. Azarmandi is a doctor of peace and conflict studies. I always talk about you as just being like a doctor of racism because that's kind of how you described your doctorate. From the School of Education, Health and Human Development at the University of Canterbury. And today's conversations, Mahdis, couldn't, I think, be more suited to have you on. And I imagine you must be run off your feet now with media from all over the country wanting to talk to you about peace and conflict resolution. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I mean, primarily maybe also because this is not the geographical area of my expertise, but no, it's not usually, we don't usually turn to people who study the alternatives to war in order to understand what's happening. It kind of goes back to the people who talk in these really, I guess, set dimensions of that's just, what happens between global players rather than looking at, okay, what can we say about this actual phenomenon of war rather than who is currently doing it, right? Yeah. So I find the conversations are quite interesting. And then it's also really manifested a lot of these other hierarchies that are issues in society with the racism that we see that's targeting people who are leaving the Ukraine who aren't, white people.
Yeah, well, listen, we've got a lot coming up today, so we're going to rip into it. And look, doesn't matter in theoretically how hangover any of us are, we can still get on with our jobs. It's just not an issue. We can just get on with doing things. We are going to be having a chat with John Minto shortly about the idea of the comparisons and being made, and are they fair, to the 81 Springbok tour, because that's going around the media at the moment. We're going to be talking a bit about the Ukraine. We promised this yesterday, and talking about Maria Burmaka, who was the Ukrainian artist who basically said go fuck yourself to Putin on BBC. And we're also going to have a little bit about the coverage of the Ukraine, and is it feeling a bit racist at the moment, with a lot in the Western media going, isn't it weird that all those white people are at war? I don't understand it, and kind of not acknowledging other wars that have been going on forevermore. But we're going to start with Green Party co-leader Marama Davidson, who I can just see coming back into shot. So we won't quite go to Marama before she's there, because if we went to you too soon, Marama, it would have been an empty screen, but it's not. So welcome to BHN. First time you on it for us. And obviously, Mahdis. And we really wanted to touch base with you to sort of give us it's kind of a week that was at Parliament. So as sort of the one person in this group who has spent some of the week that was at Parliament, why don't you tell us of your experiences from this week?
Morena, Pat. Lovely to see you again, Mahdis. It's really lovely to see you both this morning. The week that was at Parliament, chaos outside, I guess. It's really hard for me to call it a protest, because those of us who are staunch about the right to protest, good and hard, do not want to be associated with that was happening outside. The chaos of it, the unhinged fundamentals at the bottom of it and pushing it and behind it, the lack of cohesive purpose and values and tikanga, and of course, as I know Mahdis knows very well about, and yourself, Pat, it ignores the underlying sort of hatred, outright white supremacist driver when we call it a protest. So I've been trying to think of another word, but it was just utter chaos and hateful. And so I was standing there at the window looking out and seeing people getting very hurt. People know that I am not and never want to uphold a narrative of police as heroes. What I do acknowledge is the courage and the step change that the Greens and Māori and activist communities have long been calling for, with a de-escalation approach and a harm minimization approach. And then just to see people getting hurt in front of your eyes and your workplace is always going to rock you. It's violence. It's violence, and violence should not sit well with us ever, no matter who is involved. And fire, in this context, has a visceral, violent nature about it. It was setting on light hundreds of year old pahutakawa tree and native trees and children's playgrounds. And, you know, I'm also not about this weird protection of material property, which has a neoliberal sort of capitalist vibe to it, but seeing our special places, our community places desecrated, and the whenua of mana whenua desecrated in this way has been chaos. Really mamai and sad, I guess, is the other word I would use to describe it. Mamai and sad, because those grifters, those influences, the people who have been whipping up disinformation and conspiracy theory to gather crowds for the purpose of chaos, creating chaos. Where the hell were they? They weren't at the front line. We saw brown people. I saw my own people right there throwing bricks, lighting fires, throwing gas canisters. I saw my own people with such hate and fury, absolute fury in their hearts. I saw my own people not listening to our people, not listening to mana whenua, not listening to trampling on Tamaiti and calling him a kupapa. You know, that was sad. And the work we have to do to restore, to connect back to our people who have been completely taken and enamored, and so that they know that we love them more than Trump. That is some de-radicalization work that is really overpowering us in terms of the enormity of it right now. But I guess, so back to your original question, Pat, it was chaos and sad is how I would sum it up.
Mahdis, you got anything you want to jump in with?
Yeah, I think when I was, watching everything unfold and the coverage of it too, I was quite taken aback with how we tried to make sense of things and why, people were saying, why are all these brown people there? And, if you stand next to a Nazi and you don't say anything to the Nazi, does that make you a Nazi? And it's been really making me think of how do we get there? Right? Like, how do these rabbit holes become so attractive for people? And I wonder if the ways in which we articulate problems, we want simplistic solutions. We want to be able to make sense of things, right? And because it's really hard to hold information that might be contradictory at times. So then people line up because we're not giving people space to hold complex information. And then they say, well, it's either, big pharma is evil, or like you're kind of blindly endorsing everything. So I was like, but you can have a critique of big pharma in ways that doesn't necessarily negate the other the facts and the scientific facts around vaccines, right? Like, those are not mutually exclusive positions. And I think the less space we create for that to actually talk about these issues, the more it aligns the people who might have some legitimate grievances, because I don't want to say, all grievances were kind of illegitimate, is that people who have legitimate grievances don't have a place to take those grievances. And then they go to the people who will say, oh, we are the ones who want nuance, who are questioning everything. So you can come here. And that's where people kind of gravitate towards. And I see something similar. I have to say, I see something similar now with the situation between Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah.
People really have this need to say, I need to know who's the bad guy and I'm the good guy, to make sense of this. And actually what happens is I'm not making an argument for like it's all relative, let's have both sides in every conversation. That's not the argument I'm making. I'm actually saying the more complexity we have, the more precise we can analyze the situation. So it's not about let's have nuance. I'm actually talking about precision. And precision is about allowing some of these, conversations to go somewhere productively. Yeah. So I think that's been like one of my concerns. But the other one that I saw was how hard it was for New Zealand to name right-wing ideology. And it almost felt like that because people didn't have shaved heads and black boots, that you couldn't see it. And I was talking to common friends of Marama and mine, and I was like, and we were talking, and he said, why is it you think people can't see it? And I said, I don't know. As somebody who grew up in Germany, you could spot people. Like, it's something that you learned to do, particularly around protests, because you didn't want those people to come and co-opt your movements. So you would always look around, and yes, some of them had shaved heads, but the vast majority of them didn't. So like people who were saying things that aligned with, fascist ideology or, alt-right ideology, like, you can detect that. It doesn't necessarily have to be extremely explicit, even though I think it was also extremely explicit at the protest. But I was like, that is saying something to us. If we're expecting people to show up and look like the Nazis out of some 1980s movie, that it's not going to happen. They're going to, be more polite and well-dressed and sophisticated and educated, and it's going to become increasingly more difficult to point out some of the flaws in these narratives that people present, which is why that's why people gravitate towards them, because they know what grievances people have, and giving them a space to come and express their grievance is what people have done, right? Like, they're like, come here, all of these different grievances. It's all about the mandates, when really the driving force, I think, wasn't quite clearly about that.
So many of what you're saying is resonating so much, and for me, the grievances that you're referring to, Mahdis, is actually trauma, and understanding then what a trauma-informed approach actually needs to look like as we try and restore and recover from this, and understanding what led to it is very much needing a trauma-informed conversation and trauma-informed responses and specialisms. And I love what you said. I was writing it down, precision, because, the glaring contradiction is that so many of us, and even myself being in the Crown, so many of us for our lives have dedicated ourselves to naming the fact that absolutely government and systems have been oppressive. We absolutely understand and have been fighting to change oppressive systems, and know that oppressive systems have traumatized our people over many generations. And yet somehow our collective movements still didn't pick everyone up so that everyone could see that we are collectively working to overthrow and recreate and re-indigenize loving systems instead of oppressive systems. So somehow we're all feeling really mummy, because we're all like, oh, we failed. How have our generations of movements, of resistance, of struggle, of connected values still managed to miss some of our people? And that precision that you refer to, and the fact that facts and science were never going to resonate, we're never going to combat people falling down into rabbit holes. It all had to, it actually for me is all summed up by people needing connection. They connected to white supremacy. They connected to Trump. I have aunties flying Trump flags on the lawn.
Wow.
Co-opting tino rangatiratanga and whakaputanga flags with their Trump flags right next, and outwardly saying, I'm a big fan of Trump. He's brought peace and healing to the world. What? So we missed some of our people, and it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. And it's not so much that there is, valid concerns is one way of putting it. I put it down to legitimate grievance. Absolutely. Legitimate grievance. And that has been difficult to see for quite some time, but it was pronounced markedly in what we saw a couple of days ago.
Hey, we're going to have to leave it there, because we have John Minto coming on in a couple of secs to talk to us about the protest and the media response to comparing it or not to what happened in 81. But one very quick question, and hopefully it's a 1 or 2 word answer. Is at any stage during that week, did you find yourself personally fearful for your own safety in the week that went with the protest going on? You did?
Many times, yeah.
So it impacted all sorts of parts, not just, it was a dangerous time. It was
I was personally harassed and intimidated in public while trying to accept a petition from another organisation who ironically are about saving children. It was purposefully intimidating and harassing. That was what they set out to do. Yeah.
Hey, Marama, thanks so much for coming on
you.
BHN. First time we've had you on, and I hope we see you lots and lots and lots more
Me
over
too.
the forthcoming days, weeks, months, and hopefully years. Fingers crossed with how this goes. Be safe, and and I kind of want to say thank you to you and all the politicians for sort of standing as one last week and this week just gone and saying, I think what the majority of New Zealand agreed with, which is, from my perspective, time to move on. This is not us. And so well done for being brave and being there. And thank you from me, at least, to you and to the other politicians who did that as well.
Thank you both. It's been wonderful hanging out with you this morning. I definitely need to come back. Kia ora.
Thanks, Marama. It is interesting, Mahdis. We're going to go straight to John Minto, who's going to talk to us about something else. But as we do that, I want to say there's been a theme this week of us, me included, George, the producer, going, we support protest. We support, even disruption to public areas and stuff for points being made. But this felt different. And it felt like other things were going on. So in saying that, let me just jump straight to John Minto, who's going to join us now. John, thanks so much for coming on to BHN this morning to have a quick chat with us. We appreciate your time, and we know we haven't got you for long, so I will just jump straight into a question, which is based around a conversation going on in the media at the moment, and I'm just bringing up a Stuff article here that's talking about it, and it's headlined it, talking about we did things differently in the 81 Springbok tour compared to the parliamentary riots. I won't even read that because I know we've got you for a limited time. I guess I just would like to get your thoughts around what you saw over the last week at Parliament and the comparisons, or not, some are saying it's inaccurate comparison, to the 81 Springbok tour and the splitting of the nation, etc., etc. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, there's no comparison with 1981. 1981, there was a clear objective, there was a clear strategy, and we were a very disciplined, focused, and organised group. I think the best comparison with what happened with the Wellington protest was the Occupy protests of about 10 years ago, when people were camped out in Wellington and Auckland, around the country, and in fact around the world, to protest against the fact that the whole global financial system was falling down, and governments were bailing out the rich. They weren't helping out the people at the bottom, but they were helping maintain the profits of the rich at the top. So the Occupy movement, it suffered too from not having a clear objectives or a clear strategy. And it ended up much the same way. After a few weeks, the police moved in and move people out. It didn't end up in scenes like we've seen in Wellington, which were obviously they were appalling scenes. But I think the most important takeaway from Wellington is that New Zealand is a deeply, deeply divided country. And what Wellington did was just brought those divisions to the fore. I know there are people who say, oh, it was all far right people, it was anti-vaxxers, it was this and this, conspiracy theorists. And that those people were there, but there were a lot of good, decent people, good, decent Kiwis in there. And the core of it being concerned about vaccine mandates. And we haven't actually had a proper discussion in New Zealand about vaccine mandates. And I think we're the worse off for it. So I think... it's not a comparison that with 81 is not the comparison. I mean, there was New Zealand's had occupations on and off for a long time. We had the first occupation I was involved in was Bastion Point, which went on for 506 days before the police and the army moved in, and those were it was civil disobedience protest, and as the Wellington one was. And I have to say, I was pleased with the way the police reacted the first few weeks. I wasn't pleased with what they did on the last day, because it was clearly, with the tension around, it was clearly going to end in violence, and I don't think it needed to.
Mahdis, you can jump in. We've only got 3 or 4 minutes with John, so I'm welcome to give the floor to you as well. If you've got a question for John or comment, go for it.
I would like to kind of follow up on this notion of the deep, deep division, because I sometimes wonder how these discursive strategies we use around division, what they actually refer to. I do think there are, obviously lots of different concerns that we should be bringing to the forefront when we talk about politics. But I'm a little bit reluctant to pick this up and say there's some deep-seated division that is supposed to be new, right? So I'd like to kind of like follow up, like what is this division, and
Yeah.
you know,
Well,
who
I
do you
think
see divided?
yeah. Look, the division is not about vaccines or mandates. The division is actually a socioeconomic division. It is the fact that for 40 years we've had neoliberal economic policies where the working class have seen their standards of living go backwards. They've seen the opportunities for their children shrink to less than their own opportunities. In other words, they see themselves going backwards. And that critical division means that you have a lot of power, people who feel powerless, right? Lots of people feel very powerless. And when you feel powerless in society, the things you seize onto the most are the things that you can control. And people could control whether they got a vaccine or not. And a lot of people said, no, we're not going to get vaccines. And they were in mostly working class people in vulnerable communities. They said no. And then the government turned around, having said no, there'll be no vaccine mandates, there'll be no sanctions on anyone who doesn't get a vaccine. The government changed its mind and said, yes, we are going to have vaccines and vaccine mandates. And that was a bridge too far. I think it was the wrong thing to do. And the World Health Organization was very clear in warning. It said vaccine mandates should be the last resort. And they are especially dangerous in countries which have big social divisions, where you have minority groups that are already vulnerable to the sort of anti-vax messaging and all of that stuff which goes on. And they said that people will see this as oppression of them. And that's exactly what the Wellington people saw. And the fact that 30% of New Zealanders had sympathy for the Wellington protest, I think that shows we've got, very, very deep division. If it hadn't been on vaccine mandates, it would have been on something else. So I think I'm looking at a wider picture rather than just,
What I hear you saying, John, is that the deep division is not necessarily about this issue, but this issue was the thing to bring forward the deep division. It's sort of a chicken and egg argument. Because what I'd also say is, I don't think there is a deep division about vaccines or mandates, because, for example, the vaccines, it's a 90 to 95% agreement in the country with 5% outliers. And I think also, even if it was 70-30, and I saw that poll, that still shows the majority of New Zealanders support the mandate. But what I want to say is, the protest at the Parliament was not about the mandates. It really wasn't. It was an anti-vaxxer protest in general. And I think it was couching itself as mandates. And I say that for a couple of reasons. I know lots of people who are in business, who are double vaxxed, who wear masks every day, who are against the mandate because they can see that there are holes in it. The people who were at the protest, not to disrespect them, weren't those people. They were the unmasked, this is fake, we watch counterspin media. It was really an anti-vaccine protest, in my honestly held belief, that was being couched as an anti-mandate, because there are some arguments to be made for the mandate conversation, but they weren't being made. So that's why I think people walk in sheep's clothing, that protest.
Yeah, well, in a sense, I can only agree. I mean, you can spin it lots of different ways, but either way you look at it, I would say lots of people came, lots of people went there because, I mean, thousands of people have been turfed out of their jobs because of the mandates, and they feel angry about that. And a lot of those people were there, but then there were all these other agendas there as well, and the far right were there trying to push their views. But I mean, the thing I would say is that the fringe became the protest in Wellington, and that was, I mean, I said it on day one, it looked incoherent, it looked disorganized, leaderless, and it would therefore fail because there was no goals and no strategy, and that's what happened. But there's still this debate we've never had about mandates, which I think
that's right. The debate didn't actually get had because it was, in my opinion, an anti-vaxxer mandate. And let me just say one more thing before we let you go, John. Thank you for your time, because you've just echoed it in the Stuff article and the article that are going around at the moment, talking about how it's not a comparison to the 81 Springbok tour. Yeah. One of the main points that have been made, that is, as I'm reading it off the article, in 1981, the message was primarily singular. Whereas
Absolutely.
the message in the week that's just gone was multicolored and multifaceted, and every person had a slightly different message for what they wanted to get through. So that's another way, I guess, that it's being said by some of your former colleagues from 1981 that,
Yes.
please don't compare this to that. It's a completely different thing. Mahdis, do you want to wrap with anything for the last kind of 60 seconds before we let John go?
No, I think it's I think highlighting that protest isn't just arbitrary of people, showing up angry, but oftentimes when there is large scale protest, there's a lot of people behind it who've put a lot of thought into strategizing how to get the message out and how to stay on message. So I think this is also a lesson for people who say, people who get angry don't know what they're doing. Sometimes it takes a lot of effort to protest things successfully. So I think tour was it was so highly, organized, and there's so much strategy behind it. And to compare, of course you can compare. The question is, should you?
No, you can't. I think I'll just mention one thing, which I think we should all be aware of. That there's been a huge backlash to the Wellington protest, and quite rightly. But one aspect's just come up in Christchurch, where the city council are now going to the Freedom and Rights Coalition and saying that they have to pay $24,000 for traffic management for the protest marches which they've organised in the last few weeks. And that seems to me to be absolutely outrageous. I've been involved in protests for 40 years. We've never paid a cent to city councils for any traffic management. And if this becomes a precedent, then suddenly the right to protest gets heavily compromised. So we've got to, if we see these things, we've got to call them out. And hopefully the mayor and councillors down here will get up and say, no, that's not going to happen in Christchurch.
Hey, John, thank you for your time. But before you leave, I just want to share a comment with you that's just come in because it's directly to you. And I think it's kind of lovely. Crazy Old World has just commented. Don't know if Crazy Old World's male or female or other. But Crazy Old World says, John, thank you. I was on the wrong side of 81 and you opened my eyes. So what a lovely way to finish up this conversation, and personal thanks from them as well.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you very much, John. That is John Minto, who made it very clear that perhaps we shouldn't be comparing this, Mahdis, to the 1981 tour for lots of reasons, many of which he just mentioned.
I think John made a really good point, and I kind of want to bring that back in terms of we should be really cautious of what precedents we set around our expectations of protests. And one of the things I constantly saw that had me concerned about the Wellington protest was that people constantly say, oh, it's not peaceful, it's not peaceful, it's not peaceful. It's disruptive. And, I kept saying to myself, I disagree with the people who are there. I disagree with pretty much every single strategy that they've chosen to use. But I don't believe that protest owes anyone to not disrupt, right? And I always think about, so if we use this to come up with changes, how those changes then going to be used against other people.
Yep.
Who might be fighting, real injustice and real oppression. So I think it's really it's not a defense of, it's not about when we speak up to, we shouldn't set precedent. It's not in any way condoning the protests in Wellington. It's kind of zooming out and saying,
No, I agree with you. And as you're talking, I was just bringing up, this is going to be the thumbnail on the video with John Minto today when it comes out. And you can't say in 1981 that there wasn't, civil disobedience and disruption and all those sorts of things. This is a photo from that. That's the thumbnail I've already made for the conversation we just had with John Minto. So it's a really, we didn't get a chance to talk to Marama about it, but it was a really interesting. I feel like some of us, and I'll put my hand up for this, there's this tugging game going on at the moment where we go, I support civil disobedience. I'm okay with that in protest. I'm okay with these ideas, but then we don't agree with this one. And can we have our cake and eat it too? And I think you can, because it also depends what the issue is about. But then, I guess the counterpoint, not that I need to put that out there, for this protest is a lot of the protesters are saying the words that they're using about us today in the media are the same words as they used about the John Mintos of the world in 1981. So that's their perspective from it as well. So yeah, it's a fascinating time.
Yeah. I also I think there is there's huge economic division. There's a lot of inequality in this country, so much of it. But I'm really reluctant to say that is what kind of drove people to these, into this protest, because a lot of those people who were, steering behind the scenes, or actually also, in front, are not people who are disenfranchised populations.
Yeah, Brian Tamaki's of the world.
Like these momfluencers are not people who are disenfranchised, but they've picked up the language of social justice movement, and they've picked up a language of oppression to make sense of their reality, which isn't about discrimination or oppression or, a lack of freedom. It's, I thought that was quite interesting. And I think we shouldn't muddle like real disenfranchised populations who have every right to be angry, with people who are coming from, a population set that for the most part of their lives has not really had to struggle. So I feel like they kind of get lost again. So we're focusing on who remained, who's throwing the rocks, which I think is important. There's some serious healing that we need in that area. But I really want that follow-up. Where are all these like moms who've been like sitting there with platforms of thousands of people, and funding?
Yep.
Right? Like, isn't that far more dangerous? I think like we're focusing on, like the person who threw the rock, the person who, set a tent on fire. Again, not condoning. But what is the actual, where's the impact? Where's the real violence? I just don't want to lose sight of that now. And now that we think it's over.
But you can take a step further, and we're about to start talking about the media. And so this is a media comment. I mean, not that it's a New Zealand thing, because we don't have the same sort of influence from the alt-right media from within a New Zealand context, but we do get it from overseas. It's the Tucker Carlsons of this world. They're saying all these things that they shouldn't be happening. It's the Fox News of this world, but they're not the ones putting themselves in the position to have to pay the consequences for it. At one stage, when Fox News was fighting against mandates for vaccines, they had a stronger mandate for a vaccine in their own building at Fox News than what the Biden plan was. There's a guy called Greg Gutfeld who does a nighttime show on Fox News, who's been railing against vaccines and mandates ever since it's been around, since Biden took over, ironically. Yet he's doing a nationwide tour at the moment, and everyone has to have a vaccination pass to come and see his live show. So that's what's happening. You're getting these influenced people who are either for financial gain or for notoriety, or maybe for shit stirring on some levels, stirring the pot. But then, as you say, I mean, I watched some live streams yesterday, not that they were these kinds of people, but they were, say, one step down. They were getting some notoriety on their live streams for being, we're going to stay here forever, we're not going anywhere. And then I watched some of their live streams when the camp was being cleared out, and they were the first ones to run outside and film from the outside and not be at the front of it. And I just thought, I don't want to see conflict. I'm not about conflict, but part of me kind of goes, hypocrites. Just if you say you're gonna stand up to the police, go and stand up to them, see what happens. I mean, I don't want to see anything bad happen to them, because as you said, and as Marama pointed out very clearly, the people on the front line were not the representation of the people who were making all the headlines, making all the noise, or creating in the waves in the background. And I think it's imperative we don't forget about that. It's imperative we don't forget about how much people like Brian Tamaki have stirred this pot, and now they are literally sitting in their ivory tower in the background, not doing anything about it.
Yeah. So why does Brian Tamaki always come up? Like, I find that also really interesting. Like, I'm no fan of Brian Tamaki, but we have figureheads that we're far more accepting to call out, right? We're like, if it comes in that shape and form and with that language, then it's really easy. It's really easy for people to say, okay, Brian Tamaki has caused a lot of damage. I really like some of the pieces that David Ferrier has done around like other mega churches and the messages that they have put out.
Peter Morclough.
Much bigger congregations. We're working with more resources. And again, people are saying, oh, who are the people who don't want to get the vaccine? And I've been really fascinated by the wellness industry. It's a, multi-billion-dollar industry, which has pushed very much like an agenda in the name of health and holistic approaches, and, with beautiful people, a very similar message. But somehow when we want to pinpoint who are the horrible people, we kind of still look at, we kind of have our our villain has a shape, and I think we need to contest that. Like, I think the villain is honestly, like, I like this article that was written on the mumfluencers, because I thought, yeah, that is very dangerous, and the reach of that is also is much further, and people will not look at that and think that they're getting an ideological message, right? Like, people will see that and they will perceive it as somehow to be neutral. And that's the real danger, that the misinformation that comes to us and is disguised, as neutrality and concern. And, I think that's where I think we need to be paying attention to at the moment.
Not to give myself a bit of a plug here, but I've had a couple of podcasts recently. This one here, episode 210. And if people want to find out more about these, you can go and have a look at Play Stuff. So go to the stuff.co.nz website and go to the Play Stuff section. Look up the DOC, Department of Conversation. This is Derek Barris. He was on Comedy Central's show, The Daily Show. And he is like a yoga expert and a food holistic. And he's saying exactly what you're saying about how the wellness world is really, so the people within California, which is primarily a liberal state, that are against the vaccine are their wellness group, and he's railing against it. So if people want to find out more about exactly what you're talking about, episode 210, and actually an episode that's probably coming out today, which is not there quite yet, is we spoke to a mumfluencer in the weekend just gone, who has had an epiphany about a year ago, has rejected all the thoughts and feelings that she had about being an anti-vaxxer mumfluencer, and has now started up a group called Back to the Vax, trying to undo the bad work that she did and trying to speak to the same people she was speaking to, saying that she was wrong. And she's doing like an apology tour around the world for trying to fix up the harm that she's caused. And that should be up on that space probably today. So if people want to check those out, not to do a little plug for my own stuff, but there you go.
That's good. Yeah, I just feel like it's if there's no complexity, people are pushed into like these real, like, false binaries sometimes.
Yeah.
Like, I was constantly told by people who knew my stance on, the vaccine, like, that I was like really blindly pro-government and and I was just like, anybody who knows me, I was just like, wow, I'm a person who's like sitting out here always, telling politicians what they can do better and how to be more accountable. And I was like, like, I was constantly being pushed into this either or. And I was like, no, I can still call out government. I can disagree with some policy. I can, disagree with some of the ways things were done. But it doesn't mean that I have to deny, any parts that I think are actually useful,
I think what you're talking about, I wrote a piece several years ago. It was around a protest going on from the unions at Auckland ports. And I wasn't a supporter of that protest. And I got hammered by numerous left-wing bloggers because I was a voice piece of the right. And I'm like, but hang on, when the NZEI introduced national standards, I wrote a piece supporting the NZEI, so much so that they put it on the front page of their site. So it's like, I'm not anti-union. I was just anti that. I didn't agree with that issue that that union was putting out there. And the piece I wrote was called, and it's a little bit pithy, but when you're writing a blog piece, ideology versus intelligent debate. And the idea that if we always just follow an ideology and nothing else ever, then we have to know that sometimes we're going to be wrong. Whereas if we kind of think through the issues that are going on and figure out what's being said and how to support it, whether we do or don't, like I wrote down when you're talking about not just nuance, but precision, it's like precision nuance. It's being able to nail down what's going on, to look at it from all perspectives or aspects, to try and figure out what's going on, not just go, well, the left says this and I agree with the left, so I agree with this. I think that's really dangerous, because sometimes the left are crazy and go out there and say things that I disagree with or I think are poor. And you've got to be able to, as you say, call out the government, even if it's where you sit politically, or support the opposition, even if it's not where you sit there politically, and kind of just use precision nuance, which is a phrase that you've coined today that I'm going to continue using, Mahdis.
Yeah, because I don't like when people say it's all nuance, because what they mean by that is all of these opinions matter, and you always need to have, if you're talking about I don't know, misogyny, you need to have a guy there that talks about why it's okay to be a misogynist, I'm like, that's not where I'm coming from. I'm actually, like, I was like, it's for me, the complexity is not about creating more gray. It's actually about being able to be more precise about what it is that you're trying to address. And we're not doing that. And I think there's something that Marama said about, like, people being kind of pulled into camps where we wouldn't naturally expect them. And then I think John kind of touched on that too, is what we see is massive political illiteracy, right? Like and when I say like literacy in terms of like being able to understand basic politics, not just, oh, this is a political party here and that's the other political party, and then you make a vote and that's politics, but how how society is governed, how we how we relate to each other, all of those questions of politics, we need to really invest in our political literacy. And I could see that with people who were talking about the protests and were talking about the prime minister, and in one sentence kind of saying she was a socialist, and then in the other sentence saying she supported Hitler, and I was horrified. I mean, I was horrified that people do not know the difference. They don't know the difference between socialism and fascism. That's really concerning. Yeah. So I've just been like at home and I thought, when did this happen? And how did this happen?
Yeah.
Surely this doesn't come out of the blue. This is, years in the making of us also like divesting from subjects that increase, our political awareness and thinking that those questions are actually important for us to think about in schools, but also in our journalism.
Yeah, well, listen, maybe it's a good time to jump into one of the other topics of the day, which was sort of the media and how they're talking about and treating the Ukraine issues at the moment. Now, we've used this clip once before this week, but I want to play it again, and there's some other things we're going to add to it. There is a conversation going on. It is some of the reporting coming out of the West about Ukraine, well, let's be honest and just say racist, because comments like this are being broadcast live on channels like CBS.
This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen. So it's partly human nature, but they are not in denial.
So it's pretty ugly, I mean, so they're white. I mean, it's basically white. How is this happening here? Oh, my camera's just shut off. I'll fix that in a second. The other thing is I'll put up another clip now, and that'll give me a chance to fix up my camera. This kind of hurts me a little bit to my heart because, my camera's come back. Because this is one of my favorite comedians, one of my favorite performers. And he's not a news commentator, obviously, but there's this thought going out there that how can this be happening in a place that could impact me? How could this be happening in a place where they've lived all their lives, kind of ignoring the fact that in Baghdad or in the Sudan or other places, they've also lived all their lives, and it's been happening for a long time. Let me play this clip and then I'll sort my camera out. Here we go.
I've never before really considered that a war could end up actually physically affecting the UK. And that's a huge long shot. We're a huge distance away from it. That's a huge kind of leap of kind of logic that this could. But that's made me and people I meet very scared. And we're talking about how scared we are with this kind of thing. And you think, and that's a kind of minor kind of chance. But there's these people who are actually being affected by this now, in the city they've lived in the city they've grown up in. And it's happening now as we're being broadcast.
That's about all we need of that. So this realization that this is happening now, whereas you could arguably say that at any second of any day of the week for the last 100 years, and it being war going on, conflict going on in a city where people live, has been happening now. There's one other thing, and sorry to take up so much time, Mahdis, but I will put it out there because it's kind of more of an official response. And that's the Arab and Middle Eastern Journalists Association pointed out that some comments by Western journalists, that wasn't a journalist, the last one, but two ago were, either privileged the Ukrainians' Caucasian race or economic status, contrasting them with people from the Middle East or North African countries. So maybe more of now like an official word coming out going, hey, we can see this happening as well. As I've always kind of said, not tongue in cheek completely, but slightly, you are sort of an expert in racism, and that's where your studies is, and you're now a doctorate of peace and conflict studies, or a doctor of peace and conflict studies. Again, this has been a fantastic show because I've been the dumbest in the room every single time, and I just want to sit back and just give you the floor and see what you want to say about this whole thing.
I don't know if I have anything to say that hasn't been said by other people. So I think we're seeing multiple things. This notion of they look just like us. I think that's one, and the other one is the proximity of the war to the rest of Europe. And I want to like point to a flaw in how like Western countries like to, and I categorize that like just blatant statement, how they like to think about warfare. So the UK obviously has been at had troops in Iraq. Like the US is at war in a number of nations around the world. Other European countries were involved in the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. So these European countries are at war. They have been for decades in other nations, but somehow, because the war isn't happening on their territory, they're telling themselves that they haven't been at war. So I think that's a really important one for us to consider. And then the other one is that people now suddenly understand the horrors of warfare. So I find in some ways, I actually want to see more of how we've been covering Ukraine. I want the media to focus on that war needs to be avoided. Like it's not something that we wish upon anybody. It's showing us, images of people, and it's very compelling how that story is told. So I actually want, more of that compassion, more of this outrage when we look at warfare, more support for people who are impacted by war, who have to flee. So what is kind of hard to process as a person, who's kind of like European and from the Middle East at the same time, is knowing that at the Polish border, we know that throughout this entire winter, so Northern Hemisphere winter, people have been freezing to death, right? Families, children, women, people are freezing to death because they couldn't cross the border. And we're talking about Afghan refugees, Syrian refugees, who've been there for months. And then for me to see that we see a nation at war and our humanity kicks in, and we have these processes so you can take the train now for free. All of lots of European nations are allowing free train travel for anybody who manages to get on a train. They're taking people through from the Ukraine to Poland all the way to Germany. They're put in place policies to process people really quickly and give them 3 years as of now, like people who come as refugees from, who are fleeing war in the Ukraine. So it just shows us it's possible. Like the same Europe that for years has been saying we don't have space. The same Europe where people are dying in the Mediterranean Sea, which is the deadliest border in the world, every day. We now see that Europe has the capacity to act in line with the values that it says it has. But we also see that there's this is only extended to certain Ukrainians, right? So not everybody who's fleeing Ukraine is being granted the same compassion. So I'm thinking about international students who've been trying to leave, who've been held at the border, many of whom don't have proper identification on them I'm just citing it from things that I've read in the news, is that people did not have their passports at home. Some people had their documentation at the university, and they just packed up their stuff, and they're now finding themselves being kicked off trains, not being allowed to board on trains. But if they get onto a train and make it to a border, they're not allowed to cross. Activists in Berlin who were mobilizing to receive hundreds and thousands of people who were coming from the Ukraine were reporting yesterday that they had called the German police, and they were telling them that the trains are delayed because the German police has been given an order to check all the Black people on the train, right? And and ask them to get off the train. So and bringing these pointing to the hypocrisy, I think, cannot be framed as people not wanting to stop the war. I think we need to be really cautious. People who say, hey, hold on, you're concerned about warfare, you don't want children dying. Okay, that's great. Like, what about all these other places? I always like to tell people it's not about us saying don't show compassion to a population who's experiencing warfare. It's the opposite of that. It's actually asking people to be responsible and accountable to the things that they say. So if they say, nobody should experience war, well, then that goes for Syrians, that goes for Yemenis, it goes for Palestinian people. And when companies tell us, oh, we have a staunch no politics policy, and it's okay now to show political messages when it's against the war in Ukraine, I think it's important that we point that out. But it's really revealed something that most people who are from Yemen, Palestine, Syria have known for a very long time. And I would have to add, like, a lot of conflicts that happens in the African continent that is, sometimes not classified as war because it's, classified as armed conflict, as if that somehow makes it better. Is that some people care, like we care more about some people than others. And then this example has made it so explicit. Like, people are telling us to our face, right? Like, it's different because they are like us. And I think partially it is maybe because they are like them. I don't know. I think it has also a lot to do with who the supposed enemy is. And I think,
what you've been saying, just confirming what you're saying, because we've spoken to Tom Much twice this week. So we've had a correspondent. We've spoken to a Kiwi journalist in the Ukraine twice this week, and he was also saying exactly what you're saying about people being denied at the border, apparently based on race. Like, if they weren't Caucasian Ukrainians, they were getting stopped and frisked a lot more and denied a lot more, whether it's because they weren't Ukrainians or whether even if they were Ukrainians but of African ancestry, they were going on. Now, hey, our producer George is a bit of an expert. He's studied a lot around the areas of the Ukraine. He's sitting there waiting, pushing all the buttons in the background, looking after us. And George, I see you've jumped your screen up. You got something you want to add into this?
Yeah, someone made a great point the other day about something that you guys have just been discussing, really. The fact that, the footballers in the past or other sports people would get fined or even lose their jobs for displaying, for example, Palestinian flags. I also wanted to point out the comedian guy who was talking about, speculating about how the UK could get affected by war in Europe and this sort of thing. We don't have to. It's not too much of a stretch to realize that Western foreign policy has affected everyday people in Europe with blowback from the war on terror and these sorts of things, right? That that Europe was basically under attack by ISIS as a consequence of years and years of intervention in the Middle East and these sorts of things. So yeah, people, I guess, have a sort of narrow worldview sometimes when it comes to these sorts of things. The other thing that really interests me with this stuff is basically the spectating of war for entertainment in the West. And I think this just one more tweet here, Pat, because this is just mind-blowing and beyond parody. John Cena, who plays this character Peacemaker, who is meant to be a parody of American sort of attitude that they are the world police. He's very violent, and it's basically a parody of America as the world police, as doing violence for making peace. But that seems to have totally gone over his head, where he says here, if I could somehow summon the powers of a real life peacemaker, I think this would be a great time to do so. Somehow totally missing the point of parody.
Yeah, it'd be like the guys from South Park coming out and being serious, going, hey, it's time for Team America World Police to come and fix this problem up.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you both super quick. Now, we normally wrap up about midday. It's sort of 5 to midday now, and I do want to talk about one other thing quickly. But quickly, we talked about this yesterday, George, and it seems that, and I played the comedian, fair or unfair that we portray him in that way. But let's say that some people have got a wake-up call because of the Ukraine. Are we happier that they've got a wake-up call that hopefully will now flow on into the rest of their lives for other conflicts? Or are we just going, oh, you guys are dicks, you're never going to get it, and you're being hypocritical right now? Or am I being unfair with those two parallels? Mahdis, what do you think?
I don't know. I feel like I'm a bit more pessimistic.
Yeah.
I think I would see it as a wake up call if I could see real life, like real effort to understand and maybe mobilize against war, against militarization, against imperialism. Whether that imperialism is the imperialism of, like countries like the US or the imperialism of the Russians. But I don't see that now. I find the ease with which people are drumming the war drums has me concerned. I just feel, I wish people's response to this was, oh, wow, we need a world with less nuclear weapons. We need a world without less military. We need a world in which countries don't just go in and do, like steal resources or bomb people into democracy. And I wish I was seeing more of that, like a more global turn towards, and maybe an anti-war movement that was, really strong, and didn't want to like push for these false binaries, right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
Putin is really bad, therefore NATO must be really good. And I just feel like we're actually trying to push towards a war rather than a de-escalation of the war and ending of the war. So at the moment, I'm a little bit more pessimistic.
I guess it's a little bit like when something terrible happens, we are compassionate and we say the right things and we're there for everybody in that moment. And 6 weeks later, we're worried about getting the first iPhone 14 again. That all goes away. Whatever the tragedy is, whether it's the horrific events in Christchurch with the mosque, whether it's 9/11, whether it's the Ukraine being invaded, it's like in this moment, the world is turned towards the Ukraine with compassion and caring, and we got to see something and we got to make a change and look at this conflict. Oh, and look at the conflict around the world. And, Commonwealth Games starts in a few months and we'll probably forget about it then and get on with seeing how many golds we win. It's very easy to be in the moment and be on the right side of history. But I think that's got to continue on. You can't just forget about it when it's not on the front page anymore, or even if it's still on the front page, but it's down the bottom and the latest gold medal by a snowboarder is on the top of the half of the front page. You know what I mean?
I just hope that we use this opportunity though. Like, I just want to see this opportunity of countries opening their arms to refugees. I think if this is what's happening and we have a moment to change our politics or commit to what we're saying we're about, then we by all means we should. So I just use the example of the borders and people trying to cross borders as one example, but I think there's other things that we see happening that we can say, yeah, actually we should be calling things out. We should allow a space to have political debates in football, and we shouldn't penalize people for doing so when they are addressing issues of violence and oppression somewhere else.
Yeah, it is fascinating when you see that with the world change and all of a sudden things become either acceptable or not acceptable. Someone pointed out the other day, Colin Kaepernick taking a knee a couple of years ago ended his career, and he was never hired again to play football again. Yet last year in the NBA, in every kind of sporting event, now the Black Caps are doing it. Everyone's now taking a knee, for Black Lives Matter. But Colin Kaepernick has never been reinstated with being kind of the first person to sort of make that stand. Yet now everybody's doing it, and he's still seen as a pariah amongst his chosen field of employment. It's bizarre.
It folds back in, like the powers that be are able to co-opt it back in. Formula One is a great example. At the start of every Formula One race, they'll have a 2-minute set time where the drivers are allowed to do a gesture. They're allowed to take a knee, wear a T-shirt or that says, we race as one, and then a sort of beep will go off after 2 minutes. when the drivers have to immediately take off their t-shirts, stand up, and go back to their cars, right? So it's given this space, this controlled space. It's co-opted into the sort of the corporate machine of Formula One and motorsports in general, and sort of, de-weaponized or made impotent.
Hey, let's do this last one. I know we normally wrap up right about now, Mahdis. Have you got a couple more minutes just to do this last one quickly?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So I wanted to talk about this because we talked about it yesterday, and I actually ended up connecting with Maria yesterday. I haven't heard back from her today. We hope she's safe and well. But when I was talking to her yesterday over the internet, she was in a bunker in Kiev. I have seen that this morning she's been online. You get that warning. She was on Facebook 28 minutes ago. So we're hoping that she's okay and all safe. But the BBC asked her a question where they basically said, if you could speak to Putin, what would you say? Right? So that was sort of the setup. And this is what she said.
But we are very friendly folk. But you are take a genocide in our country. And like our soldiers say, the Русский военный корабль, fuck you. And
Maria.
People,
sorry, Maria. I understand, Maria. Listen, I really understand the depth of feeling. I've got to apologise to our viewers for the language there. Thank you so much for talking to us. Keep singing, and please stay safe as well. And just once again, apologies for the language there, but I'm sure watching this morning you understand how strong Maria's feelings are.
So there was a couple of things about that I was going to throw out there. The first is, there seems to be these incredibly strong women. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of strong people in the Ukraine at the moment, but we're getting examples of grandmothers offering soldiers sunflower seeds. And we had the video yesterday of Maria. She's in her apartment. She stayed in Kiev when everybody else left. She's got a speaker to her window and she's singing the national anthem. And you've got other people in Kiev on the other side of the city showing that they're hearing her singing this national anthem. And she gets asked, what do you think? And she's like, fuck you, Putin. And the BBC goes, and I wonder, maybe it's the wrong, sorry, that's my British BBC voice. I wonder if it's the wrong time, not the wrong time, but maybe it's a bit pithy and a bit unimportant to talk about. But I was wondering as well, I want to hear your thoughts on that actual situation. But also, isn't it time in the media that we get over this? It's like, you're talking to someone in a war zone who wants to say, you're invading my country, and so fuck off. And don't we all get that in this day and age? Don't we all understand, that if you say that's okay? So, I mean, I know that's a more minor point, but I just wanted to give you guys a chance to respond to Maria and what she said and the vibe of that on the BBC. Mahdis, it's yours.
I wasn't aware that you could say fuck you on the BBC or fuck. I'm assuming is the issue there, not the you. I'm wondering, and I don't know, like maybe I'm just like being too nice to the journalist, is like his response just a way to mitigate because it's in some kind of violation and just kind of dampen the blowback by concerned parents who might have been watching. But personally, I don't necessarily think he or most people who were watching took any offense to that, because it's a quite natural reaction, I think, to have when your country's being attacked by someone. I don't know what to say, because I wasn't quite aware of what the broadcasting standards say about which language is deemed appropriate or not.
Well, I know that within New Zealand, and I worked in radio for 20 years, broadcasting standards about language basically go, if the listener doesn't expect to hear it, then it shouldn't be said. So we always just talk about, if you heard someone say fuck or shit or something on the rock radio station, probably would not cause a broadcasting complaint to be upheld. But if you heard it on News Talk ZB, maybe it would. Different audience, so there's some expectation. I don't know if that's exactly the same in the UK, but that's a part of the broadcasting standards in New Zealand. Of course, being on the internet now, we can say fucking whatever we want as much as we want, which is fantastic, so people can talk as they want to talk. So I don't know about that, but yeah, I mean, George, you're a tutor in journalism, so I'd love to get your take on this as well, because to have someone on board because they're doing this patriotic thing. She's fighting against Putin in her way. She's a musician, she's a singer, and she's singing over Kiev the national anthem while the Russian forces are literally there. And they didn't restrain her. They didn't tell her off, but they were doing what you said, Mahdis. They were basically doing, I think, this is probably outside our scope of complaints. We may get upheld for by a broadcasting authority type of thing, and we don't want a flood of complaints to come in. So I'm going to try and, kind of cut it off at the knees. But I don't know. I just think it's 2022, for goodness sake. If people are worried about the word fuck, it seems we're beyond that. But George,
it's definitely a culturally British thing, right? If we go to Germany or Denmark, then on their state broadcasters, you will hear whatever words, really. So it definitely seems to be just one of those sort of like artifacts or legacies of that you just will never really get rid of in British broadcasting standards, or indeed in New Zealand British broadcasting standards. It seems one of those things that people have gotten over, but it sort of just remains nonetheless.
The language thing is interesting though, and I noticed for the first time I sometimes watch Graham Norton, and he said fuck a couple of times in his show the other day, and I'm like, oh, that was, I was like, it didn't shock me, but I'm like, I hadn't heard that before. But I was watching a clip in America, and we talked to someone about this a wee while ago, I think on the podcast, and maybe it was on this, I get confused, and it was a clip of Joe Rogan saying the N-word, and it was played on the Daily Show. And when I was in broadcasting, the C word and the N word were the worst words for broadcasting standards. Yet in this clip on the Daily Show, they allowed the clip to go forward with all the N words being said. Yet they also played his apology. And when he said, I fucked up, they bleeped the F word. And although even that's a bit of a commentary about what the broadcasting field in this station thinks is okay, that arguably a word that's worse said by a Caucasian person, the N-word, was allowed to play, yet when the same person said the word fuck, they bleeped it. I don't know how that quite pans out, but it was fascinating.
Yeah, broadcasting standards, or I guess cultural rules and norms, are full of all these little interesting contradictions, right? And part of critique often is to sort of make those clear and explicit, and sort of make clear the absurdity of some of these discursive rules.
Anything you want to finish up with there on that, Mahdis?
Not on that one. I just, in case any New Zealand-based journalists are listening, the way we write about the story, like the examples of what we've been talking about, whether that's the protest or what's happening in Ukraine, like really well-meaning, supposedly neutral people have like framed the story as, oh, could this potentially be World War III? Like Europe at the brink of war, which completely erases, by the way, the war in the Balkans, which was also inside Europe. Don't do that, right? Like, just don't center Europe in the way we narrate history, as if all these other places don't matter. So yeah, that's just my 2 cents for how we talk and how we write. It's important to maintain, like, to be precise, and in order to be precise, you need to understand the ins and outs and the complex ways of the situation. Don't fall into the traps of false binaries. These are the good ones and these are the bad ones, and there's nothing to be critiqued in between. And please don't make this about, oh, this is horrible because it might impact the rest of Europe. I mean, yeah, that gets me want to say the F word.
Do you think sometimes we just need to go, this is horrible because this is horrible? I mean, we don't need to justify it, or it's horrific because it's horrific. I mean, there are reasons as well, because it's an invasion of a sovereign country, but we don't need to justify why it's horrific. It's just horrific. Yeah,
but also we need to push and lobby for all the other things that we are complicit in that are horrific to also end. $7 billion of Afghanistan being basically held captive by the US government. Like, our governments are making choices that participate in warfare. So we need to be accountable to those too. So, one thing is to show our human compassion and be outraged, support, people, innocent people who are experiencing violence, but then also to follow up with that and say, hey, hold on, okay, let me have a look at what is it that we're actually involved in.
It's also an opportunity to question why we think of Europe as this sort of sacred place that's at the center of history, right? And contemplate, like, maybe World War III, maybe our allies, America, have been waging World War III for the past 20 years, right? So it's an opportunity. There is an opportunity, and as pessimistic as I also am, there is an opportunity to sort of open our eyes and our horizons.
Hey guys, thanks for coming in. Dr. Mahdis Azarmandi from University of Canterbury. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for jumping in today and adding your expertise and conversation to some of these topics, which actually fitted you. So, I mean, it's coincidental basically that these things came up today and you came on today, and it was amazing. And thank you so much for being a part of it. George, thank you for producing. For those who have watched or are going to watch beyond this, thank you for doing that. Remember, you can always get in touch. Best way to do it is at our YouTube channel. You can see the YouTube channel scrolling down the bottom there. And as we say, the best way you can support us and help us is to share our shit. So some clips will be coming out shortly. We will be putting some of this content out again as individual clips. Like it, share it, tell other people about us. And I guess if there's nothing else, thank you again, Mahdis. We will see everybody on Monday at 11 a.m. for the next episode or installment of BHN. Thanks, Mahdis. Really appreciated it.
Thank you, Dave.